Aron Ralston. In April 2003, Aron went hiking alone in Utah's Blue John Canyon without telling anyone. As he navigated a narrow passage, a massive boulder dislodged, pinning his right arm against the canyon wall. With no one knowing his whereabouts, Aron was in a dire situation. For 5 days, he tried everything to free himself, including pulling, pushing, and chipping away at the rock, but nothing worked. He rationed his limited food and water, but eventually, he knew he had to take drastic action to survive. On the 5th day, with his water gone and no hope of rescue, Aron made a life-changing decision to amputate his arm and, after using a dull pocket knife, essentially broke the bones in his arm using his body weight against the trapped arm. If that wasn't excruciatingly painful enough, the knife was so dull that it couldn't cut through his bones, and thus, Ralston had to break his own bone before he could amputate the arm. After escaping the boulder's grip, Aron still had to rappel down a 65-foot cliff and hike several miles before a family finally found him on a day hike. They alerted authorities, and he was rescued. Aron's heroic act to save himself from dying while pinned against a massive rock was later depicted in the movie 127 Hours. Juliane Koepcke. On Christmas Eve 1971, 17-year-old Juliane was flying over the Peruvian rainforest when her plane was struck by lightning and disintegrated midair. Miraculously, she survived the fall while strapped to her seat. Unlike her mother, who died on the spot, Juliane became the only survivor of Flight 508, surviving a nearly 7,000-foot fall into the jungle surrounded by the scattered plane debris. Although the thick forest canopy saved her life, she still had a broken collarbone, a deep gash in her leg, and her right eye was swollen shut. Juliane's father had taught her jungle surviving skills, which now became handy. She followed a nearby stream for 9 days and walked approximately 10 miles with only candy as food, hoping it would lead to civilization. She faced venomous snakes, swarms of insects, and relentless heat. Despite her injuries worsening, she finally stumbled upon a logging camp where workers took her to safety. Her incredible ordeal and survival were later shown in the documentary named Wings of Hope. Juliane Koepcke's survival would not have been possible without her quick thinking and willpower. Not only did she survive a plane crash, but she also conquered one of the most harsh environments on Earth. Hugh Glass. Hugh Glass's survival story is one for the ages. Back in 1823, while on a fur trapping expedition led by General Ashley in South Dakota, Glass stumbled upon a mother bear with 2 cubs. Glass was attacked by the grizzly bear and mauled so severely that his scalp was partially torn off, and he was left with a deep gash across his throat, along with a broken leg and exposed rib. Since Glass was in such bad condition and unconscious, it was thought his death was imminent. Therefore, John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger from the expedition party were asked to stay behind, dig his grave, and bury him. However, these men soon fled the scene due to an attack by Arikara warriors. But Glass was not ready to die and regained consciousness. He set his broken leg, wrapped himself in the bear hide, allowed maggots to clean some of his wounds, and soon began a painstakingly slow crawl back to civilization. With no weapons, he relied on his knowledge of the wilderness, eating berries, roots, and the occasional small animal he could catch. He even warded off wolves to steal their kill. Even with such severe injuries, he managed to crawl and stumble over 200 miles to reach Fort Kiowa, which took him 6 weeks. After recovering, he sought out the men who had abandoned him, and eventually, instead of taking revenge, Glass ultimately forgave them. Given the incredible lengths the man went to survive, the movie The Revenant was made after him. Joe Simpson. In 1985, 25-year-old British mountaineer Joe Simpson and his climbing partner, Simon Yates, set out to climb the west face of Sierra Grande in the Peruvian Andes. The climb was technically challenging, but they reached the summit successfully. However, with little time to celebrate due to changing weather conditions, trouble struck upon descending. Joe slipped, fell, and broke his right leg, leaving him completely unable to walk. In an attempt to lower him down the mountain, Simon inadvertently lowered Joe over a cliff edge. The situation was difficult as there was no way to pull him back up, and they could not see or hear each other. Having held onto the rope and suffered in freezing cold for over an hour, Simon made the heart-wrenching decision to cut the rope, sending Joe plunging into the deep crevasse. Miraculously, Joe Simpson survived the fall. Over the next 3 days, he crawled and hopped across glaciers and through the snow with a broken leg, no food, and minimal water. On the verge of death, he finally reached the base camp just as Simon was preparing to leave. Their story of survival and the bonds of friendship were later chronicled in the book and film Touching the Void. Poon Lim. In 1942, during World War II, a Chinese sailor, Poon Lim, was a steward on a British merchant ship when a German U-boat torpedoed it. As the boat sank, he managed to grab a life jacket and jump into the water, eventually finding himself adrift on a small wooden raft. For a staggering 133 days, Lim survived alone in the South Atlantic Ocean. During this time, he collected rainwater and creatively fashioned tools from parts of the raft, including a water container. While fishing, he even managed to catch a small shark using a fish hook he had made from a nail at one point. Lim's ingenuity to stay alive and resourcefulness kept him alive despite facing storms, sunburn, and near starvation. During his long stay at the sea, Lim passed by several ships, but none of them offered any help. One ship even fired shots at him, mistaking him for an enemy combatant. Lim was finally rescued by Brazilian fishermen, weak but alive. His incredible story earned him the British Empire Medal, and he still holds the record for the longest survival on a raft at sea. After the tragic incident, Lim moved to the United States, where he dedicated his life to working in different maritime roles. Stephen Callahan. In 1981, Stephen Callahan's solo voyage from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean turned into a nightmare. 6 days into his sailing, his boat, the Napoleon Solo, was struck by an unknown object, likely a whale, and sank, leaving him adrift in a life raft with minimal supplies. For 76 days, he floated 1,800 miles, battling hunger, dehydration, and the relentless sun. But Callahan was not one to give up. He put his creative mind to work, using a makeshift spear gun to catch fish and a solar still to generate drinking water. With this resourcefulness, he managed to capture over 30 fish and nearly 20 gallons of water. Sharks circled his tiny vessel and storms threatened to capsize him, but he persevered. He faced constant threats but used his knowledge and skills to stay alive. Finally, he was spotted by fishermen near the Caribbean island of Marie-Galante and rescued. He later shared his experience with the U.S. Coast Guard, which recognized his insights as necessary skills in raft making. His incredible story of survival was recounted in his book, Adrift: 76 Days Lost at Sea. And he was also a consultant for the film Life of Pi, sharing his expertise on survival at sea. Ricky Megee. Ricky Megee's survival in the Australian outback reads like a gritty survival film with a twist of dark humor. The Northern Territory being one of the most inhospitable places on Earth with extreme temperatures and limited resources, Megee's story is considered a modern miracle. In 2006, after his car broke down in a stranded desert, Megee found himself isolated with nothing but the sun, sand, and a growing appetite for frogs. For 71 days, he lived off insects, small animals, and whatever scraps he could find, hosting his own Survivor Outback edition. While this food wasn't the most nutritious choice, he needed to eat some kind of fluid to keep him from dying of heat stroke. The man was determined to make it well and alive out of the situation, and thus set to making shelters out of random debris and sipping water from cattle troughs. Megee demonstrated a superb knack for survival. During his ordeal, he lost over 100 pounds. When farm workers finally discovered him, he was in such rough shape, they might have thought they had found a mirage or a fragile, very dehydrated ghost. Megee's epic 10-week survival was later chronicled in his book, Left for Dead. Mauro Prosperi. In 1994, Mauro Prosperi, an Italian endurance athlete, was competing in the Marathon des Sables, a 150-mile, 6-day trek across the Sahara Desert. During the race, Mauro suddenly found himself in a sandstorm and steered severely off course, turning his race into a game of hide-and-seek with few chances of winning. Stranded for 9 days, Prosperi wandered through the desert with extremely limited supplies. He survived basically only by drinking his urine, eating bats and lizards, and trying to stay hydrated with dew and any moisture he could find. During his survival, Prosperi had even unknowingly crossed the border from Morocco to Algeria. Eventually, Prosperi was found by a group of Tuareg nomads who provided him with help and guided him to safety. His weight had dropped 35 pounds, and he was severely dehydrated, but had survived the ordeal. Prosperi's story of endurance and survival has become legendary among ultramarathon runners and adventurers, proving that with will and grit, you can turn a disastrous misadventure into a story of remarkable patience. Ada Blackjack. Left behind on a deserted Arctic island with nearly finished supplies by your companions, and not for a few days or weeks, but for 2 whole years. This was Ada Blackjack's reality in 1921. She joined an expedition led by Canadian explorer Stephenson to Wrangel Island, a remote island in the Chukchi Sea north of Siberia. The expedition included 4 men and Ada, who was hired as a seamstress and cook. The expedition soon encountered difficulties as they were unable to secure enough food. 3 of her fellow explorers left to seek help, but never returned. She was left behind with a sick crew member who soon after died. Ada was actually terrified of the Arctic expedition and had only agreed to join because she needed money to take care of her sick son. Now, she was left alone to fight her strongest fears. With her survival skills being put to the ultimate test, Ada had to get creative. She hunted seals, trapped foxes, and made her own clothes from animal skins. She even had to fend off polar bears, proving that her survival toolkit was not just limited to crafting. Ada battled the elements for 2 long years with nothing but her wits and determination. In 1923, when a rescue team finally arrived, they found her alive and well, probably wondering how she managed to pull off such a feat. Anna Bågenholm. In 1999, this Swedish radiologist, while skiing in the mountains near Narvik, Norway, lost control and fell headfirst into a frozen stream, a survival story of one of the most extreme cases of hypothermia ever recorded. What happened was that she got trapped under a sheet of ice and ended up spending almost 1.5 hours submerged in icy water, with her body temperature plummeting to a record low 56.7 degrees Fahrenheit, initially turning her into a human popsicle. While her friends and rescue teams scrambled to free her from her icy prison, her heart stopped for 40 minutes and she was clinically dead before being revived by a team of medical professionals. Doctors used a combination of heated intravenous fluids, continuous chest compressions, and a heart-lung bypass machine to revive her. Reviving her back to life was worthy of any medical drama. After weeks in intensive care, Bågenholm made a full recovery with no lasting brain damage, proving that even a frosty setback can't freeze the human spirit. Her survival was not just a personal win, it was a breakthrough in hypothermia treatment and showing the remarkable ability of the human body to bounce back from the brink of ice-cold doom.